In October 1347, 12 ships docked in the Sicilian port of Messina. The sailors aboard were either dead or dying, their bodies covered in grotesque black boils that oozed blood and pus. Within 5 years, these ships would trigger a catastrophe that would kill half of Europe's population. This is the story of the Black Death, the plague that ended the medieval world and gave birth to our modern age. To understand the Black Death, you need to understand medieval Europe in the early 1300s. This was a world at its breaking point. For 3 centuries, Europe's population had been exploding. Villages had transformed into towns, towns into cities. By 1340, Europe was home to roughly 75 million people, more than it had ever sustained before. But this growth came at a terrible cost. Forests had been cleared for farmland. Cities were overcrowded nightmares where families of 6 or 7 crammed into single-room homes. There was no sewage system. Human waste was simply thrown into the streets. Wells were contaminated. Rats thrived in the garbage that piled up in alleyways. Europe had created the perfect conditions for a pandemic, and it had no idea what was coming. The plague itself didn't originate in Europe. It began somewhere in the steppes of Central Asia, possibly in what is now Mongolia or China. The bacterium responsible, Yersinia pestis, lived in fleas that infested rats and other rodents. For centuries, it had circulated in isolated pockets, occasionally wiping out a village here, a town there. But in the 1340s, something changed. The Mongol Empire had created an unprecedented network of trade routes connecting east and west, the famous Silk Road. Merchants, soldiers, and travelers moved constantly between China, India, Persia, and Europe. And with them came the rats. The fleas. The plague. By 1346, the disease had reached the Crimean Peninsula on the Black Sea, where Italian merchants maintained a trading post called Kaffa. What happened at Kaffa is one of history's most disturbing moments. The city was under siege by a Mongol army when plague broke out in the Mongol camp. Soldiers died by the hundreds. But before retreating, the Mongol commander made a calculated decision. He ordered his men to load the plague-infected corpses onto catapults and hurl them over the walls into the city. It was biological warfare centuries before the term existed. The Italians inside Kaffa were infected almost immediately. Panic set in. Merchants fled the city, boarding ships bound for Constantinople, Venice, Genoa, and Sicily. They carried more than silk and spices in their cargo holds. They carried death itself. When those 12 ships arrived in Messina in October 1347, the authorities knew immediately something was wrong. The sailors were in agony. They had massive, painful swellings, buboes, in their necks, armpits, and groins. These lumps were the size of eggs, sometimes as large as apples, filled with blood and pus. The victims coughed up blood. They developed black patches on their skin as blood vessels burst beneath the surface. The stench was unbearable. Medieval doctors had never seen anything like it. They had no concept of bacteria or viruses, no understanding of contagion as we know it. They believed disease was caused by miasma, bad air, or by an unfavorable alignment of planets, or as divine punishment for sin. They tried their traditional remedies, bloodletting, applying leeches, burning aromatic herbs. Nothing worked. The Sicilian authorities ordered the ships out of the harbor, but it was already too late. The plague had come ashore. Within days, people in Messina began falling ill. Within weeks, they were dying by the dozens. Within months, the city was in complete chaos. The dead were piling up faster than the living could bury them. Families abandoned their sick relatives out of fear. Priests refused to give last rites. The social order that held medieval society together was beginning to collapse. And Messina was just the beginning. From Sicily, the plague spread with terrifying speed. It moved up the Italian peninsula to Florence, Genoa, and Venice. It crossed the Mediterranean to France and Spain. It traveled along trade routes into Germany, England, and Scandinavia. By 1348, less than a year after those ships docked in Messina, the Black Death had infected nearly all of Europe. No one understood what was happening. No one knew how to stop it. And the death toll was about to reach numbers that would make the Black Death the deadliest pandemic in human history. By the spring of 1348, Europe was experiencing death on a scale no generation had ever witnessed. The plague moved through cities like wildfire through dry timber. In Florence, the poet Giovanni Boccaccio watched in horror as his city died around him. He would later write that more than 100,000 people perished in Florence alone, in a city that had housed perhaps 120,000 before the plague arrived. The numbers were staggering everywhere. In Siena, half the population died. In Venice, 600 people were dying every single day at the peak of the outbreak. Paris lost nearly half its residents. In some smaller villages, everyone died, the entire community simply ceased to exist. These weren't just statistics. These were mothers, fathers, children. Families wiped out in days. Bloodlines that had existed for centuries ending in a single generation. The speed was perhaps the most terrifying aspect. A person could wake up healthy in the morning and be dead by nightfall. The bubonic form of the plague, transmitted by flea bites, typically killed within 3 to 5 days. But there were two other forms even more deadly. The pneumonic plague attacked the lungs directly, spreading through coughing and breathing. It killed within 2 days, sometimes within hours. The septicemic plague infected the bloodstream and could kill in a single day. Medieval doctors were completely helpless. Some wore elaborate costumes, long robes, gloves, and bird-like masks stuffed with aromatic herbs, believing that bad air caused the disease and that pleasant smells would protect them. It didn't work. Doctors died at the same rates as everyone else. Some fled the cities entirely, abandoning their patients. Those who stayed tried increasingly desperate remedies. They lanced the buboes with hot pokers, applied poultices of human feces, had patients drink mercury and arsenic. The treatments often killed as surely as the disease itself. As the death toll mounted, the basic structures of medieval society began to disintegrate. The dead quickly outnumbered the living's ability to bury them with dignity. Church graveyards filled up within weeks. Cities dug enormous plague pits, mass graves where bodies were thrown in by the hundreds, sometimes by the thousands, with barely a prayer said over them. In Avignon, where the Pope resided, the situation became so desperate that Pope Clement VI was forced to consecrate the entire Rhone River as holy ground so that bodies could simply be dumped into it. Imagine that moment, a spiritual leader having to declare a river itself sacred because there was literally nowhere else to put the dead. The clergy, who were expected to comfort the dying and perform burial rites, died in extraordinary numbers. Priests had to enter infected homes, hear confessions, give last rites, handle contaminated bodies. In England, it's estimated that 40 to 50% of all clergy perished. Entire monasteries were wiped out. The Church, which had been the most powerful institution in medieval Europe, was revealed to be just as vulnerable as everyone else. Labor disappeared almost overnight. Fields went unplowed because there was no one left to work them. Harvests rotted because there was no one to bring them in. Livestock wandered freely through abandoned villages, eventually dying of starvation or being consumed by wolves. The economy, which had been based on agricultural production and the labor of peasants, simply stopped functioning. In the cities, the situation was equally catastrophic. Shops closed. Markets emptied. Craftsmen died, taking their specialized knowledge with them. In some trades, entire guilds were wiped out. The infrastructure of daily life collapsed. Garbage piled up. Wells became contaminated. The rats, and their plague-carrying fleas, thrived in the chaos. When faced with incomprehensible catastrophe, people respond in unpredictable ways. Some medieval Europeans turned to extreme religious devotion. Groups called flagellants roamed from town to town, whipping themselves bloody in public displays of penance. They believed the plague was God's punishment for humanity's sins, and that by punishing themselves, they could appease divine wrath. Hundreds of men would march through city streets, stripping to the waist and lashing their backs with leather whips embedded with metal spikes until blood ran down their bodies. Crowds would gather to watch, some joining in, believing this spectacle of suffering might save them. But others turned darker. When prayer and penance failed to stop the dying, people looked for scapegoats. Rumors spread that someone must be deliberately causing the plague. Poisoning wells, spreading disease intentionally. And in a pattern that would repeat throughout history, minority communities became targets. Jewish communities across Europe faced horrific persecution. They were accused of poisoning water supplies to kill Christians, a baseless conspiracy theory that nonetheless led to unspeakable violence. In Strasbourg, 2,000 Jews were burned alive. In Mainz, the entire Jewish quarter was destroyed. In hundreds of towns and cities, Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were annihilated, not by the plague, but by their Christian neighbors. Meanwhile, some people responded to the certainty of death with complete abandonment of social norms. Why save money if you'll be dead tomorrow? Why work? Why maintain morality? Boccaccio described people who shut themselves away in their homes, drinking and feasting while the world died outside. Others went the opposite direction, living recklessly, drinking in taverns, engaging in public debauchery, embracing hedonism in the face of oblivion. The medieval world wasn't just dying physically. Its moral and social fabric was tearing apart. The plague didn't simply appear everywhere at once. It moved across Europe with a terrible, methodical precision, following the routes of human commerce and contact. From Sicily in late 1347, it crept northward through Italy. By early 1348, it had reached France. By summer, it was in England. By 1349, it engulfed Germany, the Low Countries, and pushed into Scandinavia. By 1350, it had reached Scotland, Ireland, and the furthest corners of Eastern Europe. By 1353, the initial wave had finally begun to subside, but only after visiting nearly every corner of the continent. People tried to outrun it. When plague appeared in a city, those wealthy enough to flee did so immediately. They packed their belongings and escaped to their country estates, convinced that the fresh rural air would protect them. Sometimes it worked, for a while. But the plague always caught up. It traveled in the cargo of merchants, in the clothing of refugees, in the bodies of the rats that infested every human settlement. There was nowhere to hide. England's experience reveals the plague's inexorable march. It arrived in June 1348 at the port of Melcombe Regis in Dorset, likely carried by a ship from Gascony. Within weeks, it had spread to Bristol, one of England's largest cities. By autumn, it reached London. The English chronicler Geoffrey Le Baker wrote that the living were scarcely able to bury the dead. The plague moved through England like a scythe through wheat, cutting down villages, towns, and cities indiscriminately. London became a city of ghosts. The population, which had been around 70,000 before the plague, was devastated. Some estimates suggest that nearly half died. The city's graveyards overflowed so quickly that the Bishop of London purchased extra land specifically for plague burials. One site, East Smithfield, became a mass burial ground where archaeologists have since found more than 2,500 skeletons layered in carefully arranged trenches. Evidence of a society trying to maintain dignity even as it drowned in corpses. But cities, as terrible as their suffering was, at least had infrastructure and organization. Rural villages often fared worse. Small communities lacked the resources to cope with mass death. When the plague arrived in a village of 50 people and killed 30 of them, the entire social structure collapsed. There weren't enough survivors to maintain the fields, operate the mill, or provide the specialized labor needed to sustain a farming community. Across England alone, more than 1,000 villages were abandoned during and after the Black Death. These weren't temporary abandonments, they were permanent. The survivors, too few to maintain the community, simply left. They migrated to other villages or to towns, seeking safety in numbers or opportunity in the chaos. Today, if you know where to look in the English countryside, you can still see the faint outlines of these lost villages. Ridges and fields that were once house foundations, depressions that were village ponds, the footprint of a church that no longer exists. One such village was Tusmore in Oxfordshire. Before 1348, it was a thriving community with dozens of families. After the plague, it ceased to exist. The land returned to nature. The homes crumbled. The names of its inhabitants were forgotten. Tusmore became one of thousands of deserted medieval villages, communities erased from existence by the plague. The devastation wasn't uniform across Europe. Some regions suffered more than others, though the reasons remain debated. Italy and southern France seem to have lost 60 to 70% of their populations in some areas. Germany and England typically lost between 30 and 50%. Poland and parts of Eastern Europe, more isolated from major trade routes, suffered less, though still catastrophically. A few places were mysteriously spared or lightly touched. Milan, one of Italy's great cities, suffered far less than its neighbors, possibly because the city's archbishop ordered strict quarantine measures, including the brutal practice of walling up infected houses with the sick still inside. The Kingdom of Poland, on Europe's eastern frontier, lost fewer people, perhaps due to its relative isolation or possibly different housing conditions that limited rat populations. But these were exceptions. The overwhelming reality was death on a scale that defied comprehension. Modern historians estimate that Europe lost between 75 and 200 million people, roughly 30 to 60% of the total population. In raw numbers, the Black Death killed more Europeans than both world wars combined. It killed more people in 5 years than the HIV/AIDS epidemic has killed worldwide in 40 years. Living through the Black Death wasn't just physically devastating, it was psychologically apocalyptic. Imagine watching half the people you know die within a year. Your neighbors, your family members, your children. The baker who sold you bread yesterday is dead today. The priest who blessed you last Sunday is being thrown into a plague pit this Sunday. Death wasn't an occasional tragedy, it was the constant, overwhelming reality of daily existence. This trauma left deep scars in European culture. Art from the period and the decades following is obsessed with death. The Dance of Death, or Danse Macabre, became a popular artistic motif, paintings and frescoes showing skeletons leading people of all social classes in a dance toward the grave. Kings danced alongside peasants, bishops alongside beggars. The message was clear: death comes for everyone, and all worldly status is meaningless. Literature changed too. Before the plague, medieval writing often focused on chivalry, courtly love, and religious devotion. After the plague, literature became darker, more cynical, more focused on the fragility of life and the certainty of death. Boccaccio's Decameron, written during the plague years, tells stories of people fleeing Florence to escape death, stories filled with moral ambiguity, dark humor, and the sense that the old certainties of medieval life had crumbled. Chronicles from the period reveal the psychological weight. The English monk Henry Knighton wrote, "In this year and the next, there was a general mortality of men throughout the whole world." The French chronicler Jean de Venette described a world where the living were scarcely sufficient to bury the dead. These weren't just observations, they were testimonies from people watching their entire world die. Religious faith, which had been the bedrock of medieval life, was shaken to its core. People had prayed. They had done penance. They had made pilgrimages and offered donations to the church. And still they died. Still their children died. The church's promises of divine protection rang hollow when priests and bishops died at the same rates as everyone else. Questions that had previously been unthinkable began to surface. If God allows this, what does that say about God? If prayer doesn't work, why pray? The certainty of the medieval worldview, that God ordered all things, that the church mediated salvation, that social hierarchy reflected divine will, was being tested in the crucible of unprecedented suffering. And as the plague years dragged on, that worldview would begin to crack in ways that would ultimately reshape Western civilization. But we're not there yet. First, Europe had to survive. And survival meant enduring not just the physical death toll, but the complete transformation of every aspect of medieval life. By 1353, the worst of the initial outbreak had passed. The plague hadn't disappeared, it would return in waves for centuries, but the apocalyptic death rates had subsided. Europe could finally take stock of what remained. What the survivors saw was a world transformed beyond recognition. Half the population was gone. Entire families had been extinguished. Villages stood empty. Fields had returned to wilderness. The economic, social, and political structures that had governed medieval life for centuries had been shattered. But here's what makes the Black Death so historically significant: it didn't just destroy the old world. It created space for an entirely new one. The survivors found themselves living in a world where the old rules no longer applied, where scarcity had become abundance, where power had shifted in ways no one could have predicted. The plague had reset European society, and what emerged from the ashes would be radically different from what had existed before. The most immediate change was economic. Before the plague, Europe's exploding population had created a surplus of labor. Land was valuable, workers were cheap. Peasants had no bargaining power. They worked the lord's land in exchange for protection and a small plot for themselves, trapped in a feudal system that offered no mobility and little hope of improvement. This was simply the way things were, the way things had always been, the way God had ordained them to be. But after the plague, everything changed. Suddenly, there weren't enough workers. Fields needed plowing, but half the plowmen were dead. Harvests needed bringing in, but the laborers were gone. Lords who had once commanded armies of peasants now found themselves begging for workers. And the surviving peasants realized something revolutionary: they had power. For the first time in centuries, ordinary workers could make demands. They could ask for higher wages. They could refuse unfavorable terms. They could leave one lord's land and seek better conditions elsewhere. And they did, in numbers that terrified the aristocracy. Wages for agricultural laborers doubled, sometimes tripled. Peasants began eating meat regularly, something that had been a luxury before the plague. They wore better clothing. They demanded and received rights and freedoms that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. The ruling classes were horrified. In England, Parliament passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, attempting to freeze wages at pre-plague levels and restrict workers' mobility. Similar laws appeared across Europe. But they were largely unenforceable. How do you force people to work for low wages when there aren't enough workers to begin with? The economic reality trumped legal theory. The balance of power had shifted, and no law could shift it back. The newfound power of the peasantry didn't always manifest peacefully. In 1358, French peasants rose up in a massive revolt called the Jacquerie. Driven by years of economic oppression, war taxation, and the breakdown of the old social order after the plague, they attacked nobles' castles, killed aristocrats, and briefly seized control of the countryside north of Paris. The revolt was eventually crushed with extraordinary brutality, but it sent shockwaves through European society. The peasants. The lowest class, the people who were supposed to be docile and obedient, had risen up against their masters. In England, similar tensions exploded in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381. Led by figures like Wat Tyler and inspired by the radical preacher John Ball, thousands of peasants marched on London demanding an end to serfdom and the feudal system itself. John Ball's famous sermon asked a question that would have been dangerous to even whisper before the plague. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman? In other words, if everyone is equal in God's eyes, what justifies the existence of nobles and lords? The revolt was crushed, its leaders executed. But the question had been asked, and it couldn't be unasked. The plague had exposed the fundamental injustice of the feudal system. If a peasant and a lord died the same death from the same disease, how could anyone claim that their social positions were ordained by God? The ideological foundation of medieval hierarchy was crumbling. The church's authority was similarly undermined. Remember, the clergy had died in enormous numbers, up to 50% in some regions. The institutional knowledge, spiritual authority, and educational foundation of the church had been decimated. To fill the empty positions, the church was forced to ordain priests quickly, often with minimal training. The quality of clergy declined noticeably. Moreover, the church had failed its fundamental test. It had promised that faith and prayer would protect the righteous. It hadn't. Priests had fled their parishes. Bishops had abandoned their dioceses. The Pope himself had hidden in his palace in Avignon while the plague raged outside. The people noticed. Religious devotion didn't disappear. This was still a deeply religious age, but it became more personal, more skeptical of institutional authority. People began to question whether they really needed priests to mediate their relationship with God. The economic transformations rippled outward in unexpected ways. With fewer people, land became cheap. Peasants who had never dreamed of owning property could now acquire it. Small farmers became larger farmers. Some became wealthy. A new class began to emerge, not nobles born to privilege, but successful farmers and merchants who had accumulated wealth through their own efforts. Urban areas experienced their own transformation. Cities had been hit hard by the plague, but those who survived found new opportunities. With guild masters dead, apprentices could advance more quickly. With half the craftsmen gone, those who remained could charge more for their work. Wages rose across the board. Workers had disposable income, again, something relatively new for the lower classes. This extra money created demand for goods beyond basic necessities. Craftsmen began producing better quality items. Merchants imported luxuries that had previously been available only to the elite. A consumer economy began to emerge. The rigid economic structure of medieval feudalism, where most people produced everything they needed and rarely engaged in commerce, was giving way to a more dynamic market economy. Technology advanced too. With labor scarce and expensive, there was suddenly incentive to develop labor-saving devices. Water mills and windmills proliferated. New agricultural techniques spread more quickly. Innovations in metalworking, textile production, and manufacturing accelerated. The seeds of the later Industrial Revolution were being planted in the post-plague economy. Education changed as well. Before the plague, literacy had been largely confined to the clergy and a small noble elite. But as commerce grew more complex and new professional classes emerged, literacy became valuable for merchants, administrators, and craftsmen. Universities, which had been devastated by the plague, reopened and adapted. Vernacular languages, English, French, German, Italian, began to be used for education changed as well. Before the plague, literacy had been largely confined to the clergy and a small noble elite. But as commerce grew more complex and new professional classes emerged, literacy became valuable for merchants, administrators, and craftsmen. Universities, which had been devastated by the plague, reopened and adapted. Vernacular languages, English, French, German, Italian, began to be used for education and literature, not just Latin. Knowledge was slowly being democratized. None of this happened overnight. These were gradual transformations that would unfold over decades and centuries. But the Black Death was the catalyst. It shattered the old order so completely that a new order could emerge. The medieval world was dying, not just because half its population had perished, but because its fundamental structures, beliefs, and power dynamics had been exposed as fragile and ultimately unsustainable. The survivors weren't just rebuilding what had been lost. They were, consciously or not, building something entirely new. And that new world would eventually become recognizable as the early modern period, the world that would lead to the Renaissance, the Reformation, the Age of Exploration, and ultimately, our modern world. Here's something most people don't realize about the Black Death: it didn't end in 1353. That first catastrophic wave was just the beginning. The plague became endemic in Europe, returning in cycles every 10 to 20 years for the next 400 years. There were major outbreaks in 1361, 1369, 1374, 1400, 1438, and dozens more. London experienced significant plague outbreaks roughly every decade until the Great Plague of 1665. The last major outbreak in Western Europe occurred in Marseille in 1720. These later outbreaks were never as devastating as the initial wave, partly because the most vulnerable had already died, partly because populations were smaller and less dense, and partly because people developed better, though still imperfect, methods of containment. But each recurrence brought fresh trauma, killed thousands, and reminded Europeans that death could return at any moment. This constant threat fundamentally shaped European psychology for centuries. The plague became woven into the fabric of daily life. People made wills young, knowing they might die tomorrow. Art remained obsessed with mortality. Literature was permeated with awareness of death's proximity. The phrase, memento mori, remember you must die, became a cultural touchstone. Europeans lived with a visceral awareness of life's fragility that's difficult for modern people to fully comprehend. But paradoxically, this intimacy with death also liberated the survivors. If death could come at any moment, if all worldly status dissolved in the face of plague, then perhaps the rigid hierarchies and restrictions of the old world mattered less than people had thought. Perhaps individual achievement, personal merit, and human potential mattered more than birthright. This shift in thinking was one of the forces that would fuel the Renaissance. The Italian Renaissance. That extraordinary flowering of art, literature, science, and humanistic thinking, emerged directly from the ashes of the Black Death. This isn't coincidence. The plague created the conditions that made the Renaissance possible. First, there was wealth. The plague had killed people, but it hadn't destroyed property or gold. The survivors inherited everything. In Florence, wealthy merchant families like the Medici accumulated enormous fortunes in the post-plague economy. They had money to spend, and they spent it on art, architecture, scholarship, and culture. Patronage flourished. Artists like Donatello, Botticelli, and later Michelangelo found generous sponsors willing to fund ambitious projects. Second, there was a shift in values. The medieval focus on the afterlife gave way to greater interest in earthly existence and human achievement. If life was short and uncertain, shouldn't we celebrate human creativity and potential while we can? This humanistic philosophy, placing human experience and reason at the center of intellectual inquiry, became the foundation of Renaissance thought. Third, there was social mobility. The old feudal order had broken down. Talented individuals from modest backgrounds could rise through skill and intelligence. Artists were no longer anonymous craftsmen but celebrated individuals. Scholars from common families could attend universities. The rigid class system of the medieval period was loosening, creating space for exceptional individuals to flourish regardless of birth. The printing press, invented by Johannes Gutenberg around 1440, accelerated these changes exponentially. Books, which had been painstakingly copied by hand and available only to the wealthy elite, could now be mass-produced. Knowledge spread rapidly. Ideas that would have taken decades to circulate across Europe could now spread in months. The democratization of knowledge that began after the plague reached a critical mass. And what was one of the first major books printed? The Bible. But in vernacular languages, not just Latin. This meant ordinary people could read scripture themselves without clerical interpretation. The implications were revolutionary and would contribute directly to the Protestant Reformation of the 1500s, another massive disruption to the old medieval order. The plague also transformed medicine, though the path was long and frustrating. Medieval doctors had been completely helpless against the Black Death. Their theories were wrong, their treatments useless or harmful. But this catastrophic failure eventually sparked a revolution in medical thinking. Physicians began to observe disease more carefully and systematically. They noticed that plague seemed to spread through contact. People who touched the sick often became sick themselves. This led to the development of quarantine practices. Venice established the first formal quarantine system in 1423, requiring ships to anchor for 40 days before crew could disembark. Other cities followed. These measures weren't perfect, but they represented a shift from supernatural explanations to practical, empirical approaches. Autopsy, which had been forbidden or restricted during much of the medieval period due to religious prohibitions, became more common. Physicians began dissecting plague victims to understand what the disease did to the body. This hands-on investigation of human anatomy laid groundwork for the medical revolution of the Renaissance and beyond. The plague also prompted the first systematic public health measures. Cities appointed health boards, established pest houses for isolating the sick, organized removal of corpses, and attempted to improve sanitation. These were the earliest forms of organized public health infrastructure. Imperfect and often ineffective, but representing a new approach to disease as a community problem requiring collective action rather than just individual misfortune or divine punishment. It would be centuries before scientists identified Yersinia pestis as the bacterial culprit and understood the rat-flea-human transmission cycle. That discovery came only in the 1890s during a plague outbreak in Hong Kong. So what did the Black Death ultimately give us? What is its legacy in our modern world? It gave us the end of feudalism and the rise of a wage-based economy. The idea that workers have value and can negotiate for fair compensation, a concept we take for granted today, emerged from the post-plague labor shortage. The modern labor movement, workers' rights, the very concept of economic mobility, all have roots in the transformations that followed the plague. It gave us the Renaissance and the cultural explosion that followed. The art, literature, architecture, and humanistic philosophy that we associate with European cultural achievement emerged directly from the post-plague world. Without the Black Death shattering the medieval order, the cultural stagnation of the Middle Ages might have continued for centuries longer. It gave us the scientific method and empirical medicine. The plague's exposure of medieval medicine's failures prompted the slow, painful development of observation-based, evidence-driven approaches to understanding disease. Modern medicine, public health systems, epidemiology, all trace their origins to lessons learned, often tragically, during the plague years. It gave us social mobility and the idea that individual merit matters more than birth. The rigid class system of medieval Europe, where your life was determined entirely by your parentage, couldn't survive the plague's equalizing devastation. The modern idea that anyone can rise through talent and hard work emerged from the cracks in that broken system. It gave us religious pluralism and individual faith. The Church's failure during the plague, combined with later access to printed Bibles, contributed to the Protestant Reformation and the eventual acceptance that religious authority could be questioned. The religious freedom we value today has roots in that crisis of faith. Most fundamentally, the Black Death demonstrated humanity's resilience. Half of Europe died, and the survivors rebuilt. They didn't just recreate what had been lost, they created something better. They innovated, adapted, questioned, and ultimately transformed their entire civilization. The plague was the worst catastrophe in European history, but it also became the catalyst for progress that would reshape the world. Today, the Black Death can seem like distant history. A medieval horror story disconnected from our modern lives. But its echoes surround us. The labor rights we enjoy, the scientific medicine we depend on, the cultural achievements we celebrate, the social mobility we value, all emerged from that crucible of suffering. The plague killed somewhere between 75 and 200 million people across Europe, Asia, and North Africa. Each one was someone's child, parent, sibling, friend. Each had dreams, fears, hopes, and stories that died with them. The scope of loss is almost impossible to comprehend. But those who survived carried forward their memory by building a different world. They refused to simply accept the old order's return. They asked dangerous questions. They demanded change. They created art and beauty and knowledge in defiance of the death that had surrounded them. The Black Death was humanity's darkest hour, and the unwitting catalyst for our modern world. It killed half of Europe, but it also killed the medieval age itself. And from that death came a rebirth that would eventually lead to the world we know today. The plague reminded humanity of its fragility. But the response to the plague demonstrated humanity's extraordinary capacity for resilience, adaptation, and transformation. That might be the most important legacy of all.